Hey guys, welcome back to The Last Climb. Today I'll be covering some incredibly stupid Karens who thought they could conquer Everest. From a boutique owner stepping off the trail for a photo, to an attorney who insisted her weekend hiking trips qualified her for Everest, where doing everything the hard way demanded something her body couldn't pay.
It was May 21st, 2018, on Everest's summit ridge at 28,500 feet, deep in the death zone where humans can survive only hours. Temperatures hit minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, oxygen dropped to 30% of sea level, and the exposed ridge left no room for error. Every step demanded precise energy and oxygen management, and even small mistakes could be fatal. Karen Dolev, 42, worked as a marketing executive for a Fortune 500 company in Dallas. She had built her career on exceeding targets and refusing to accept limits, and she brought that same mindset to Everest. Her climbing resume included Denali and Aconcagua, but she had never spent extended periods above 25,000 feet, where the human body deteriorates quickly, regardless of fitness. She approached the expedition like a professional objective, measurable, attainable, and under her control, but the mountain operates on a different rule set. You can't negotiate with the altitude. It doesn't care how determined you are. The summit ridge is one of the most dangerous parts of the entire climb. Even with supplemental oxygen, climbers must adhere to strict turnaround times, usually between noon and 2 p.m., to allow for safe descent. Guides enforce these rules because the margin for error is minuscule. Afternoon conditions often deteriorate rapidly, winds increase, and visibility drops. Karen had been moving aggressively throughout the ascent, consuming oxygen at a higher than average rate. She was still 400 vertical feet below the summit, already behind the schedule that would have ensured survival. At this point, I could tell that pushing forward was becoming more than just risky. It was straight up life-threatening. When her guide ordered the turnaround, she refused. Karen argued that she was close enough to the summit to continue safely, pointing to other climbers still ascending. She treated the instructions as suggestions rather than life-saving rules. Her oxygen supply was insufficient for both the ascent and a safe descent, but she dismissed the calculations. It's hard not to see this as classic summit fever. The investment, the ego, the mindset that success outweighs survival. Against explicit warnings, she pressed on. By early afternoon, the weather turned faster than forecasted. Winds exceeded 40 miles per hour, snow drove horizontally, and visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. Her oxygen supply reached critically low levels, forcing her to ration what little remained. Reduced oxygen combined with extreme exertion slowed her movement and impaired coordination. Every step required focus she could no longer fully summon. Watching a climber like this, you realize that determination alone can't replace oxygen or timing. It becomes cruelly obvious how fragile the human body is up here. Approximately 200 feet below the summit, Karen's supplemental oxygen was effectively gone. She relied solely on the ambient air, which cannot sustain life at this altitude for long. Hypoxia set in quickly. Confusion, poor balance, and impaired judgment made steady movement impossible. Cold exposure accelerated hypothermia, and she collapsed repeatedly along the ridge. It's a harsh reality. At this height, the environment will win if you ignore the rules. Survival isn't negotiable. Other climbers nearby were also fighting for survival and could not provide meaningful help. Rescue was impossible given the extreme wind, low temperatures, and exposure on the ridge. Karen became stranded, and her body slowly shut down under the combined effects of hypoxia and hypothermia. It's sobering to think how quickly the situation escalates. The summit seems so close, yet the death zone doesn't forgive hesitation or defiance. Despite desperate attempts by nearby climbers to offer support, she never regained consciousness. Her body succumbed to oxygen deprivation and extreme cold. Recovery was only possible later in the season, when conditions allowed safe access. The expedition's medical officer ruled the cause of death as hypoxia complicated by severe hypothermia, with contributing factors including refusal to follow turnaround times and mismanagement of oxygen. The incident was documented in climbing summaries as a reminder of the deadly consequences of ignoring protocols in the death zone. Karen's drive to reach the summit, the same force that fueled her professional achievements, had prevented her from recognizing when retreat was the only way to survive. At that altitude, ambition and determination don't change the outcome. The conditions don't adjust to the climber, and exceeding physical limits at that altitude leads to rapid decline. It was May 14th, 2016, on the balcony, a wind-scoured shelf at 27,500 feet on Everest's southeast ridge, when Talia Bren, fuming and impatient, complained loudly about the slow idiots ahead of her, tapped her crampons impatiently, and demanded everyone let her pass, a 2-minute rest turning fatal in the thin air. Talia was 38, a self-assured earth science teacher from Portland, Oregon, who believed she knew more than the guides and apparently resented anyone questioning her judgment. She had only a handful of technical climbs to her name: easy Cascades routes, a single Aconcagua summit, and 2 aborted Himalayan attempts where the guide said later that she blamed the weather rather than her lack of experience. She had never attempted a true high-altitude push without supplemental oxygen. I personally think that for her, Everest was less a goal than a trophy she felt entitled to conquer. Preparation for Talia was more about appearances than skill. She carried a pulse oximeter and logged readings obsessively, but only to prove to herself and others how capable she was. She had been vocal about summiting without supplemental oxygen, dismissing guides' warnings as unnecessary, and she openly criticized climbers who relied on bottles. On summit night, the emergency oxygen bottle was recovered from her pack, valve closed, unused, despite repeated offers from guides to help her use it. The death zone, above 26,000 feet, is a clinical designation, not a dramatic one. At that altitude, oxygen partial pressure falls to roughly 1/3 of sea level. The brain deteriorates before the body does, and in ways the person experiencing it cannot reliably detect. Judgment degrades first. A climber can report feeling sharp while visibly impaired to everyone nearby. The body compensates through faster breathing and elevated heart rate, which simultaneously drains fluid reserves and accelerates exhaustion. No acclimatization replaces what the air simply withholds. Talia reached the balcony just before 5 a.m., roughly 7 hours into her summit push with no supplemental oxygen. A Spanish climber named Dario Vela, moving just ahead of her, glanced back at her brash comments as she complained about useless Sherpas slowing progress, and ignored every caution about pacing. She swayed while seated, barely noticing the tilt. When asked how she felt, she waved him off, saying she was fine, with a tone that suggested annoyance rather than honesty. Her lips were noticeably darker than normal, but she dismissed it as a minor inconvenience. I'll be honest, that one detail told me exactly where this story was going before I even finished reading it. Within minutes, Talia stood abruptly and went still. She stared forward without fixing on anything. Her breathing became audible, uneven, labored, carrying a faint wet quality that experienced high-altitude climbers associate with fluid collecting in the lungs. She began producing fragmented phrases that neither Dario nor the Sherpa guide beside him could interpret. Her movements became uncoordinated, and she struggled to keep her balance. Then she stepped sideways and went down into the snow without bracing herself. Dario and the Sherpa, a man named Pemba, reached her immediately. Her body had gone fully slack. No resistance, no self-support. They managed to get her partially upright before her weight shifted back. Her eyes opened once, briefly, without tracking either of them. Her lips had deepened to a blue-purple visible even in low light. Pemba reached for her emergency oxygen bottle and worked the mask toward her face. Her breathing had already reduced to slow, widely, all spaced gasps. The mask was positioned but produced no meaningful response beneath it. Frost was forming along her nostrils and across her eyelashes. The gasps continued to space further apart. Pemba radioed base camp at approximately 5:08 a.m. Given their position on the route, any response team would have required several hours to reach them under those conditions. Talia became fully unresponsive within several minutes of collapsing. Sustained manual attempts to assist her breathing produced no recovery. The expedition report later listed the presumed cause of death as hypoxic brain injury, secondary to severe high-altitude cerebral and pulmonary edema, with secondary cardiac arrest. In plain terms, the brain and lungs filled with fluid, oxygen saturation dropped below the threshold for consciousness, and the heart stopped. No traumatic injuries, equipment undamaged. The oxygen bottle in her pack was full. Her school held a service the following month. The expedition leader released a terse statement noting her choices were deliberate, Fellow climbers remembered her arrogance and refusal to heed warnings. What makes this story chilling is that Talia knew the risks, carried the tools to survive, and still dismissed them at every stage. Her final acts were not ignorance. They were the result of overconfidence and entitlement. That gap between knowing and acting, fueled by arrogance, is what ultimately killed her. It was April 19th, 2015, in the Khumbu region of Nepal. Base camp sat at 17,600 feet on the Khumbu Glacier, a sprawling collection of colorful tents scattered across the moraine. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as climbers moved between expedition camps. Dr. Bonnie Baxter, 47, arrived as part of a commercial expedition of 12 climbers. She had completed 3 high-altitude treks, but Everest was her first technical climb above 24,000 feet. Baxter worked as an emergency room physician and made frequent references to her medical background when questioned about protocols. During the initial safety briefing, she interrupted the lead guide several times to suggest alternative approaches to altitude sickness management. During acclimatization rotations, Baxter questioned the oxygen flow rates recommended by the expedition outfitter. She adjusted her regulator settings based on her own calculations, insisting her medical training gave her better judgment. When a Sherpa pointed out her tank was depleting faster than expected, she dismissed the observation. At Camp 2, Baxter purchased an additional oxygen canister from a climber leaving early due to illness. She stored all 3 bottles in her personal tent, rather than registering the extra with expedition inventory. When her tent partner, Margaret Rosen, began showing signs of altitude sickness and asked if Baxter had oxygen to spare, Baxter said she needed every bottle for her own summit attempt. The expedition leader arranged for Rosen to receive oxygen from reserve stock and descend with a Sherpa. Baxter remarked that the climber had simply not prepared adequately for the mountain. Rosen recovered at base camp over 2 days and rejoined the expedition at Camp 4 after the team's scheduled rest day, cleared by the expedition medic to continue. Before the summit push, the expedition leader conducted mandatory equipment checks at Camp 4. When he examined Baxter's 3rd bottle, he noted visible wear on one of the regulator valves and recommended she leave it behind. Baxter stated her medical background made her qualified to evaluate the equipment herself and refused to leave it, citing ownership of the bottle. The team departed at 11 p.m. Baxter carried 3 oxygen canisters strapped to her pack, approximately 8 pounds more than other climbers carried. At 27,500 feet, Rosen struggled with her breathing and fell behind, descending with a Sherpa support climber. At 28,200 feet, roughly 700 feet below the summit, Baxter began falling behind as well, stopping 3 times within a 20-minute span. The lead guide assigned a Sherpa to stay with her and continued upward with the remaining clients. At 6:40 a.m., while the Sherpa was briefly occupied assisting another climber, Baxter unclipped from the fixed rope and moved laterally across a 40-degree snow slope. A descending climber spotted her approximately 60 feet off the established route, moving slowly without clear direction, and was unable to get her attention. She continued traversing until the slope steepened to near vertical rock, then sat down in the snow, her oxygen mask hanging loose around her neck. When the descending climber reached her, 2 of her 3 bottles were empty. The 3rd, still full, had rolled 10 feet downslope and lodged against a rock. One empty regulator showed a crack at the connection valve, the same valve the expedition leader had flagged. The climber retrieved the full bottle and attempted to connect it to her mask, but Baxter did not respond to verbal prompts or physical touch. Her eyes were open but unfocused. The climber radioed the situation at 7:10 a.m. The lead guide was at the summit and could not descend immediately due to traffic on the fixed lines. The descending climber stayed with Baxter for 20 minutes, attempting to administer oxygen and warm her hands. Her breathing became irregular and shallow. At 7:35 a.m., she slumped forward. He checked for a pulse and found none. Due to his own depleting oxygen, he marked the GPS location and continued his descent. A recovery team reached Baxter's position the following morning. Her body remained in the same seated position, 65 feet from the fixed line. The full oxygen bottle was still lodged against the rock. The official investigation determined the cause of death as severe hypoxia, leading to high-altitude cerebral edema. The faulty valve, identified during the equipment check and ignored, caused her first bottle to deplete rapidly early in the summit push. Her self-adjusted flow rates had compounded the deficit over hours. By the time she switched to her second bottle, cognitive cognitive impairment was already advanced. The wandering from the route and inability to retrieve the full bottle beside her were consistent with late-stage edema. Baxter's body was brought down the mountain over 6 days by a specialized recovery team. It was April 22, 2017, and Everest Base Camp sprawled across the Khumbu Glacier in a patchwork of expeditions clusters that grew denser every day. The moraine shifted constantly underfoot, loose rock over ancient ice that groaned and cracked at odd hours. Generators droned behind cook tents. The smell of kerosene mixed with boiling lentils and the faint chemical bite of sunscreen applied too liberally at altitude. At roughly 17,500 feet, the air was kinda thin enough to notice when you moved around, but not painful yet, which just tricks people into thinking they can handle way more than they actually can. This is one of those stories where I could feel it going sideways before anyone had even left base camp. Among the 60-odd climbers staged at base camp that week was Denise Toombs, a 49-year-old real estate agent from Scottsdale, Arizona. Denise had basically built her whole life around her marriage for 22 years and then spent 11 months watching it all come apart in divorce court. By September of the previous year, she was alone in a rented townhouse, splitting holidays with 2 college-age daughters. Friends later said she became fixated on Everest almost immediately after watching a climbing documentary about a commercial expedition, going from casual interest to full obsession within a couple of weeks. She started following Everest accounts online, bought books on high-altitude climbing, and told her daughters she was going before the year was out. The film followed a commercial team through a full climbing season. The training, the culture shock of base camp, the physical spectacle of climbers moving up through the icefall toward the summit. What the documentary did really well was make Everest look like something a regular person could totally pull off if they just wanted it bad enough. What it did not do was convey the years of incremental skill building that separated the featured climbers from someone watching on a couch in the Sonoran Desert. Honestly, I think that's the most dangerous thing a documentary can do to someone who's already looking for a reason to go. Denise watched it twice. By the following week, she had researched expedition costs. By October, she had contacted 3 commercial operators and requested applications. The process required a climbing resume showing you'd worked your way up at altitude over time, and Denise had pretty much nothing to put on one. A guided ascent of Kilimanjaro via the Morang route 2 years earlier, and weekend hikes on Camelback Mountain and trails around Sedona. That was it. What she submitted told a different story. Her application listed a successful ascent of Aconcagua at 22,841 feet, completed the previous January. She claimed a winter attempt on Mount Rainier that reached 12,500 feet before weather forced a retreat. She described a training regimen supervised by a mountaineering coach in Flagstaff. None of it was true. The Aconcagua thing was listed as an independent climb with 2 partners she only identified by first name, so it was basically impossible to check. The Rainier attempt could not be verified through the guide service she claimed to have used, and the coach in Flagstaff straight up did not exist. Denise had been running on a treadmill set to incline and watching YouTube tutorials on crampon technique, skills she had never practiced on actual ice or snow. I had to read her application twice because I genuinely could not believe how much of it was fabricated. We're not talking about exaggeration here. She built an entire climbing history out of nothing. One company accepted her application without requesting independent verification of her claimed ascents. The operator sat on the lower cost end of the commercial Everest market and relied heavily on self-reported climbing resumes, which in 2017, a lot of the cheaper companies did. The expedition fee was $46,000. Denise paid the deposit in November and the balance in February. She arrived in Kathmandu on April 8, 2017, and flew to Lukla 4 days later to begin the trek to base camp. She also arrived with a medical kit assembled from months of research on climbing forums and altitude medicine websites. The kit contained Diamox, dexamethasone in 4 mg tablets, Ambien, ibuprofen, and modafinil. During the expedition doctor's intake assessment, Denise disclosed the Diamox and ibuprofen, but said nothing about the rest. She had read stuff online about expedition doctors taking away your corticosteroids, and she wanted to keep control over what she was taking and when, which is kind of terrifying when you think about it. The dexamethasone was something she treated as a performance tool rather than emergency medication. She began taking it intermittently during the trek to base camp, then more aggressively during acclimatization rotations whenever headaches or fatigue appeared. Remember the dexamethasone. I cannot stress that enough, because by the time it matters, you'll understand why I'm flagging it now. Her assigned Sherpa was Chiwing Lendu, a 41-year-old from the Solukhumbu district with 9 Everest summits across 12 seasons. Chiwing had spent 2 decades guiding foreign clients and had developed the particular patience required for managing people whose expectations were shaped by media rather than experience. He was small, quiet, paid attention to everything, the kind of guide who would notice your crampon was loose before you even felt it shift. He had never filed a complaint about a client in 15 years of guiding. Chiwang is the kind of guide I wish every climber on this mountain got paired with. Keep that in mind when you hear what they did with his assessment. The first acclimatization rotation departed base camp on April 28th, entering the Khumbu icefall before dawn. While the frozen towers were still relatively stable, the icefall was a chaotic obstacle course of ice towers, crevasses, and aluminum ladders spanning gaps that dropped into blue darkness. Denise moved slowly from the start. She struggled with ladder crossings, gripping the fixed lines with both hands and shuffling her crampons across the rungs. At one deep crevasse, she froze for nearly 2 minutes, blocking traffic while Chiwang talked her across. By the time they reached Camp 1, Chiwang had cataloged a list of concerns. Denise struggled with rope transfers and ladder crossings, and her crampon technique was honestly all over the place for someone who supposedly topped out on a 22,000-foot peak the year before. Chiwang reported his observations to the expedition leader, Anil Tamong, through the standard channels, a quiet conversation at the mess tent after clients had gone to sleep. Anil decided to monitor the situation through the next rotation. There was no standardized way to enforce resume checks once someone was already at base camp with a permit and a support team assigned to them. Sending a client home meant refunding tens of thousands of dollars and inviting the kind of negative review that circulated on expedition forums for years. Refund a paying client or risk a life on the mountain. I've watched that math play out too many times on this channel, and the money wins every single time, until it doesn't. What Anil did not anticipate was that Denise would learn about Chiwang's report. How she found out varied across accounts. But within 48 hours of returning to base camp, Denise contacted the company's Kathmandu office via satellite phone. She described Chiwang as dismissive, unsupportive, and condescending, and requested immediate reassignment. She never brought up any of the safety stuff he had flagged. She just made the whole thing sound like a personality clash with a guide who wasn't being encouraging enough. Anil resisted initially because replacing Sherpas mid-rotation created logistical problems with rope fixing and load carry schedules. But the Kathmandu office pushed back, and Chiwang was reassigned within 2 days, moved to a different client without explanation. The message that sent to every Sherpa on that expedition was pretty clear. The paying client's feelings mattered more than a veteran guide's professional call. 15 years, not one complaint. And the moment he speaks up about something that could actually save a life, he gets reassigned. Tell me how that makes sense. Denise's second Sherpa was Sonam Rinji, a 29-year-old from the Makalu region with 4 Everest summits. Sonam was younger than most lead Sherpas and still trying to prove himself, the kind of guy who would bend over backwards to make a difficult client work. The second rotation carried them to Camp 2 at 21,200 feet. Sonam found Denise manageable at first. Her pace was slow, but steady on the relatively flat terrain of the western CWM. The problems began when she started referencing the documentary. During a rest stop, she told Sonam the film showed climbers moving faster and their pace needed to increase. Sonam explained that pacing at altitude was individualized. At Camp 2, the pattern continued. She kept referencing things from the documentary as if they were rules that should override his judgment. Other climbers noticed she seemed unusually energetic at meals, despite poor sleep, talking rapidly and confidently in ways that did not match her condition. The breaking point arrived during the acclimatization push toward Camp 3 on the Lhotse face. The face rose above Camp 2 in a continuous wall of blue ice holding between 40 and 50 degrees. Sonam planned the ascent conservatively. Depart at 4 a.m., rest every 45 minutes. Reach camp 3 by noon. Denise challenged the schedule, citing a sequence in the documentary where climbers ascended the face in a single continuous push. Sonam explained the method she described had been used by elite climbers with years of conditioning. Denise pressed. Sonam held firm. They reached Camp 3 at approximately 23,300 feet after 8 hours. Denise was visibly trembling, barely eating, sleeping fitfully in the tent carved into the face. Her oxygen saturation was poor, but still within ranges commonly seen at that altitude, making the neurological changes easier to miss. Basically, she was a lot sicker than any of her numbers showed. The drugs were just masking everything. They descended to base camp the following day. Within hours of arriving, Denise called Kathmandu again. She reported that Sonam had been argumentative and dismissive and requested another reassignment. The company complied. Sonam was moved to support duties without formal explanation. So now we're 2 for 2. 2 experienced Sherpas flagging the exact same concerns, both gone within days. I don't know how you look at that and not see what's coming. The expedition leader now faced a problem he had created through accommodation. 2 experienced Sherpas had independently assessed Denise as underprepared, and both had been removed at her request. The summit window was opening. The assignment went to Furba Kasang, a 33-year-old from the Rolwaling Valley with 6 Everest summits. Furba had been working logistics between base camp and Camp 2 rather than guiding clients, but he was available, competent, and had the steady temperament Anil hoped would work. He received his briefing on the evening of May 14th. Anil kinda minimized the earlier concerns as personality conflicts and didn't fully explain the technical warnings both previous Sherpas had raised, partly because Denise had kept completing rotations, and he figured she was managing well enough. Anil briefly considered placing Denise on supplemental oxygen earlier than the standard Camp 4 start, but left it to the new guide's discretion. Furba walked into the assignment without the context that could have changed everything. This is where I had to step away for a minute when I was researching this. Chiwang knew, Sonam knew, Anil knew, and Furba got none of it, not a single word, walking onto that face completely blind. They met the following morning. Denise appeared rested, alert, and confident. Aided by dexamethasone, she had been escalating during rotations. She discussed the summit plan with the assured vocabulary of someone who had absorbed the terminology, if not the substance, of high-altitude mountaineering. Furba found her slower than her resume suggested, but attributed it to normal client variation. The summit push departed base camp on May 16th. The weather window was holding, 3 days of reduced wind and clear skies. Teams from multiple expeditions moved upward simultaneously, filling the fixed ropes with climbers and Sherpas stretching from the icefall to the South Col. Denise and Furba reached Camp 2 on the afternoon of May 16th after 8 hours. The effort had been taxing. Denise ate sparingly, half a portion of freeze-dried pasta and some tea, before retreating to her sleeping bag. Other climbers at Camp 2 said afterwards that she looked wobbly, just walking the 30 feet between the mess tent and her sleeping tent, which at that altitude is the kind of thing experienced people pick up on immediately. She asked Furba twice what time they were departing the next morning, despite having discussed the plan less than an hour earlier. At breakfast, she was oddly energetic after a night where she barely slept, speaking faster than usual. The symptoms appeared to escalate sharply overnight as her previous dexamethasone doses wore off and she redosed aggressively. Furba did not flag the unsteadiness or the repeated question. In isolation, both fell within what exhaustion and altitude could explain. A Sherpa who had climbed with her for weeks would have recognized these as new behaviors. A Sherpa who had known her for 36 hours could not. I keep thinking about this. He'd known her for 36 hours. How do you spot something getting worse in a person when you never saw what better looked like? They departed Camp 2 at 3:30 a.m. on May 17th. The Lhotse face loomed above the western sea domain, a wall of blue-gray ice catching the first light of dawn. The temperature was approximately -8 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to make metal hardware painful through thin gloves. They clipped into the fixed ropes and began the ascent. Kick crampon points in, weight the foot, stand, slide the ascender up, repeat. 45 degrees stretching upward for thousands of feet, with nothing below except the diminishing floor of the CWM. The first hour passed without incident, but slowly. Furba noticed her crampon work was getting sloppier than the day before. She kept flat-footing the ice in spots where you really gotta be kicking your front points in. He suggested she focus on her toe points. The correction improved her technique for about 15 minutes before the old pattern returned. Twice that morning, Denise asked Furba questions he had already answered minutes earlier. At one anchor transition, she struggled unusually long with a locking carabiner she normally could have clipped herself. At roughly 22,800 feet, Denise stopped at a small shelf and leaned heavily against the slope, her forehead resting on the ice, breathing in rapid, shallow gasps that fogged her goggles. Furba waited. After several minutes, she straightened and indicated she was ready to continue. Her movements had a quality that Furba later described as mechanical, performing the actions of climbing without the fluid coordination that connected them into natural movement. When a Sherpa uses the word mechanical to describe how a client is moving, pay attention. I've seen that word show up in enough of these reports to know it's not a casual observation. It means they've already started thinking about how to get you down. What was happening inside her body had been building over the preceding days, but accelerated sharply during this push. The dexamethasone she had been escalating through each rotation had been suppressing the brain's inflammatory response to altitude, allowing her to continue ascending, while cerebral edema worsened beneath the chemical mask. Without the drugs, her symptoms would have shown up way earlier, at lower camps, where someone could have caught them and sent her down. Instead, her brain was swelling inside her skull, and the medication was losing ground against an edema that had grown progressively worse. The break came at approximately 23,100 feet. Denise stopped mid-step. Her right crampon was planted, her left foot raised to kick into the ice above, and her body simply stopped executing the sequence. Her left leg remained suspended for several seconds before lowering back to the step below. She attempted the movement again and missed the ice entirely, her crampon scraping across the surface without engaging. Furba watched her repeat the attempt a third time. Kick, miss, retract, before he recognized what he was seeing. It wasn't tiredness anymore, it was ataxia. Her brain had basically lost the ability to tell her legs what to do. Kick, miss, retract, 3 times in a row. I keep replaying that sequence in my head because it's such a quiet, undramatic way for everything to come apart. She had no idea her body had already given up on her. He called up, asking about new symptoms. Her response came several seconds late. And when it arrived, the words were disconnected from the question. She mentioned something about the documentary, about a rest stop that should be coming soon. That kind of random, disconnected answer told him everything. He needed to know about what was going on inside her head. Furba radioed Camp 2 to report signs of altitude sickness and that he was evaluating whether to descend. The response from Aniel was to monitor her closely and descend if he thought it was necessary. No additional context, no mention of previous concerns. Monitor her closely. If that doesn't make your blood boil after everything you've just heard, I don't know what will. He had 2 Sherpas worth of red flags and passed along none of them. Denise's condition deteriorated over the next stretch. She could no longer stand on the face without leaning her full weight against the fixed rope, her ascender the only thing preventing a backward slide. Her speech went from slow to completely gone, just random bits of words with long silences in between. Nothing that made any sense. She reached up twice to remove her goggles for no discernible reason, a behavior consistent with the confusion that accompanies cerebral edema. Furba made the decision to descend immediately. The problem was execution. They were on a 45-degree ice face, clipped to a rope designed for ascending. Turning a semi-conscious climber around on that angle and managing a controlled lowering required time, dexterity, and steady hands. Below them, the face dropped over 2,000 vertical feet to the western CWM. Furba anchored himself with an ice screw and began rigging Denise for descent, removing her ascender, attaching a belay device, preparing to control her weight on the fixed rope. The hardware was so cold it could burn your skin right through thin gloves, so he had to take his outer gloves off to get the control he needed to work the carabiners. His liner gloves had already become damp with sweat during the ascent and provided almost no insulation. He's working frozen metal with his bare hands at 23,000 feet for a woman he met 2 days ago. I want you to let that sit. The frostbite was already setting in, and he had absolutely no idea what it was going to cost him. Denise's body went slack at approximately 23,200 feet. Her legs stopped responding entirely. Her full weight transferred to the fixed line and Furba's anchor, leaving her hanging against the face. He was managing a rescue alone on steep ice with a patient who could not assist. He began lowering her. Release tension, let her slide a body length, lock the device, reposition, repeat. At each anchor point, he had to descend to her position, unclip her from one line, clip into the next, and resume. Every anchor transfer required him to strip off his outer gloves again, exposing damp liner gloves to wind that immediately froze the fabric stiff. The skin on his fingers had gone past the burning stage into that numb whiteness where frostbite is already doing its thing, and you just can't feel it anymore. He did not stop to rewarm them. Stopping meant she stayed on the face longer. 2 climbers descending from Camp 3 reached his position at approximately 11 a.m. A guide from another expedition and his Sherpa. They found Furba lowering Denise alone, his liner gloves soaked and frozen stiff, his fingers operating on memory rather than sensation. They immediately assisted, one managing rope below, while Furba and the other controlled from above. Denise showed no response to voice or touch during the lowering. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, and by the descent, her condition appeared to involve both cerebral and pulmonary edema. Her body was limp against the rope, arms hanging, head requiring periodic adjustment to keep her airway clear. Same thing I see every time on this channel. The person who caused all of this is on a stretcher. The person trying to fix it is losing his fingers. They reached the base of the Lhasa face at 1:15 p.m. Denise was carried across the western CWM to Camp 2 on an improvised stretcher, a 40-minute process requiring 4 people at 21,200 feet. The expedition doctor assessed her and found her unresponsive, with pupil dilation and breathing patterns consistent with severe cerebral edema. He gave her injectable dexamethasone, the same drug she had been secretly taking in escalating doses. But by that point, it was way too late to undo the damage. Cloud buildup and worsening afternoon winds made a Camp 2 helicopter extraction too risky. Teams moved her down through the icefall toward lower terrain where aircraft could reach. She was carried as far as Camp 1 before the medical team concluded further. Transport was futile. Denise Toombs was declared dead by the expedition medical team at Camp 1 on the evening of May 17, 2017. The official cause was high-altitude cerebral edema. She was 49 years old. 49 years old, and she never even made it to Camp 4. Everest didn't need the death zone for this one. I still can't wrap my head around that. It just let the medication run out, and the ice did the rest. The expedition company's internal review uncovered the full scope of what went wrong, and it went well beyond one client. Her medication kit, found at Camp 2, contained the undisclosed dexamethasone and other drugs she had never reported. The blister packs showed escalating use through the acclimatization rotations. When they dug into her climbing resume, it all fell apart. Her claimed Aconcagua ascent had no guide records attached. The Rainier attempt could not be verified through the service she named. And the training references she provided led nowhere. Chewang Lendu's original assessment was reviewed and confirmed accurate. A client lied, a company failed to verify, an expedition leader filtered out critical information, and the system folded at every point where it could have intervened. Furba Kasang was evacuated to Kathmandu 2 days later with severe frostbite to both hands. Surgeons removed 2 fingers from his left hand and 1 from his right. The damage to his remaining fingers meant he just could not grip ice screws or work carabiners or handle an ascender the way you need to for technical guiding up high. He attempted rehabilitation through the following winter, but could not regain the function the mountain had taken. Furba Kasang, 33 years old, with 6 Everest summits and a career that should have lasted another 15 years, never returned to technical high-altitude guiding on Everest. The cost of a rescue he performed for a client he had known for 2 days ended the career he had spent his whole adult life building. A woman lied on a form. A company didn't bother to check. And a 33-year-old Sherpa with 6 summits and 15 more years of guiding ahead of him will never do technical work above Camp 2 again because he spent too long trying to save her. I don't think I'll get over this one for a while. No charges were filed. The expedition company revised its application process to require documented proof of claimed descents. The revision came 1 season too late for the Sherpa who paid for the gap. It was May 18, 2016, on the upper slopes of Mount Everest, along the South Col route at around 25,000 feet. Above that point was the death zone, where the human body can only function for a limited time. Climbers move through it, knowing that delays aren't just inconvenient, they can become dangerous very quickly. Alina Vorsk, 41, worked in luxury real estate in Naples. She was used to controlling schedules and getting results on her own terms. She had climbed Mount Rainier and Denali, but nothing at this altitude. She joined a commercial expedition expecting structure and support, but not necessarily the level of discipline required. From the way this starts, it feels like she approached Everest as something she could manage, not something that would push back. The route above Camp 4 was made up of steep ice slopes with fixed ropes. Temperatures stayed around -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and winds were expected to increase later in the day. At that elevation, oxygen levels dropped to about 30% of sea level, making every step harder. Most teams leave before dawn to avoid deteriorating weather later on. Her expedition leader set a 1 a.m. departure time. That's standard, but Alina refused. She didn't want to start that early and pushed for a daylight climb instead. She eventually left around 6 a.m., about 5 hours behind the main group. That delay doesn't just put you behind schedule, it puts you in a completely different version of the mountain. As she moved higher, she began encountering climbers already descending from the summit. That meant stopping frequently, stepping aside, and waiting for others to pass. At that altitude, every stop takes effort to recover from. Breathing becomes more labored, and it's harder to regain momentum. Those pauses may not seem like much, but up there, they add up faster than people expect. By late morning, winds on Mount Everest reached 35 miles per hour. Blowing snow reduced visibility to under 30 feet, and the route became difficult to follow. At 25,500 feet, she paused on a narrow traverse, but stiff hands and hardened ice left little margin for error. Attempting to clip into the next anchor, her crampon caught, she fell sideways, and while the rope stopped her from falling down the mountain, it swung her into the slope, causing multiple rib fractures and serious head trauma. She was left suspended, unable to stabilize herself. At that point, it's not just about technique anymore. It comes down to whether your body can respond, and hers was already under too much stress. She couldn't regain proper footing, her movements slowed, and her coordination dropped. The cold continued to affect her. Her body was losing heat, and her ability to react was fading. You can see how everything starts stacking here. Fatigue, cold, and now injury. None of it is immediate on its own, but together it becomes overwhelming. Other climbers were nearby, but they were also slowed by congestion and worsening conditions. It took time for anyone to reach her, and at that altitude, time is limited. She remained in that position for over an hour. During that time, her condition continued to decline. The exposure, combined with her injuries, made recovery unlikely. Without movement or proper shelter, her body couldn't keep up with the stress. Her guides eventually reached her and tried to stabilize the situation. But moving an injured climber at that altitude, in those conditions, is extremely slow. Winds continued to increase and visibility remained low. Even with help, there's only so much anyone can do up there. The mountain sets the pace, not the people. By the time they secured her, she had already lost consciousness. She did not respond after that point. Her body was recovered 3 days later, once conditions improved enough for a safe retrieval. The cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma, with severe hypothermia as a contributing factor. Delayed timing, prolonged exposure, and exhaustion were also noted. Looking at how it unfolded, it all traces back to that early decision. Starting late didn't seem critical at the time, but up there, small choices don't stay small for long. It was May 19th, 2014, at Camp 4 on a high-altitude expedition's peak in the Nepalese Himalayas. A cluster of tents pressed into compacted snow at roughly 26,000 feet, where the wind doesn't just blow, it dismantles. 3 climbers rested intermittently on supplemental oxygen through what became one of the quietest disasters the expedition would ever document. Nobody heard her go. Nobody heard anything after. Riva. Solmund was 38 years old and worked as a structural engineer at a mid-sized consulting firm in Oslo, Norway. She had been climbing for 14 years, alpine routes through Scandinavia and the Alps before moving to the 8,000ers. This was her 3rd attempt at this summit. The first 2 had been turned back by weather, and she spent both trips loudly complaining about guides and stupid restrictions. Her teammates described her as controlling, someone who cross-referenced forecasts across 3 separate services, lectured constantly about their supposed errors, insisted on checking anchor placements herself, despite lacking real skill, and carried a laminated checklist she wielded like a badge of authority. She had taken 6 months of unpaid leave to prepare, though people said that much of that time was spent fussing over gear brands and arguing with trainers about why she deserved a personalized acclimatization plan. She was not strong and not quick, but she demanded the team follow her pace and listen to her advice. Her summit bid was planned for midnight on May 20th. At approximately 10:30 p.m. on the 19th, she left the tent, scowling and muttering about tent mates who slowed her down, insisting she needed air and couldn't wait for anyone else. The South Col is a flat, exposed saddle of glacial rock and ice with no natural windbreak in any direction. At 26,000 feet, jet stream winds can exceed 100 miles per hour without significant warning, and temperatures at night fall below minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Cognitive function at that altitude degrades measurably. Spatial reasoning deteriorates, reaction time slows. And critically, none of it feels the way it sounds from sea level. The body keeps moving, the mind just doesn't keep up. Lucen watched her headlamp move away from the tent line. Wind at that point was roughly 25 miles per hour, manageable for the elevation. Over the next hour, conditions shifted hard. Wind climbed past 60 miles per hour, temperature dropped further, visibility collapsed near zero. He called from the tent entrance twice. No response came back. At approximately 11:10 p.m., a climber in a nearby tent briefly spotted a faint light moving low to the ground, not tracking toward the fixed ropes or the camp perimeter, but erratic, close to the snow surface. It lasted a few seconds, then it was gone. That detail, one witness, a few seconds, is essentially all that exists of what happened to her in real time. The snow the next morning filled in the rest. Reva had walked less than 90 feet from the tent before her footprints began to lose direction. Spacing widened, the line drifted. Hypoxia at that altitude produces disorientation functionally indistinguishable from severe intoxication, and it compounds rapidly with cold. Her oxygen mask was found partially dislodged. A single glove was recovered approximately 10 feet away. I've read enough high-altitude incident summaries to know that 90 feet sounds like nothing, and that is precisely the problem. Beyond the glove, the stride marks transitioned into shallow drag impressions consistent with crawling. Based on depth and spacing, investigators estimated that movement covered roughly 15 feet before stopping entirely. Her body was found at approximately 6:40 a.m. by Lucen and 2 other expedition members, less than 100 feet from camp. She was face down, knees tucked beneath her torso, upper body folded forward. Ice had accumulated across her face and neck in dense, layered deposits consistent with several hours of exposure to sustained high-velocity wind. No distress signal had been activated. A mountain rescue liaison was notified by radio at 6:55 a.m. Her body was secured and relocated a short distance from the active camp area later that day due to conditions at that altitude. The expedition medical report later attributed the cause of death as fatal hypothermia with contributing hypoxic impairment. Everyone who knew Reva used roughly the same words: arrogant, controlling, overconfident. She lectured constantly, insisted on being right, and flaunted knowledge she didn't truly have. And still, less than 100 yards from shelter, in a storm that moved faster than any model had predicted, none of it mattered. That's the part most people don't absorb. The mountain doesn't negotiate with entitlement or attitude. It was April 23rd, 2013, at Everest Base Camp in Nepal. Climbers moved between expedition camps in the late morning, some preparing for rotations while others rested after descending. The Khumbu icefall loomed above, a chaotic maze of ice blocks and crevasses marking the route to Camp 1. Rosalind Fletcher, 43, worked as a corporate attorney and had signed up for a commercial Everest expedition after completing several weekend hiking trips in Colorado. On her application, she listed experience on 3 peaks above 14,000 feet. And described herself as an experienced alpine hiker with basic technical skills suitable for guided expeditions. During the initial team meeting, the expedition leader reviewed each climber's background. When asked specific questions about crampons, ice axes, and fixed rope systems, Fletcher gave general answers suggesting familiarity without concrete examples. The leader noted her responses but did not press further, as all clients would undergo skills training during acclimatization. On the first rotation to Camp 1, Fletcher struggled with the ladder crossings over crevasses in the Khumbu icefall. She required multiple attempts to clip and unclip her safety tethers at each junction and moved significantly slower than the rest of the group. Her crampon points caught on the ladder rungs twice, causing her to freeze mid-crossing. When the guide asked about her mountaineering course, Fletcher said it had covered the basics and she just needed practice. During the second rotation to Camp 2, her technique remained poor. She frequently attached her ascender backwards or failed to properly lock the cam, requiring repeated correction from guides. Her crampon work on steep ice showed poor front-pointing form, causing excessive arm fatigue. The expedition leader recommended additional practice before the next rotation. Fletcher insisted she was improving and would be ready for the summit push, mentioning the significant money and time away from her law practice she had invested. On May 15th, the expedition moved to Camp 3 at 24,000 feet for the final acclimatization rotation. The route climbed the Lhotse Face, a steep ice wall requiring continuous rope work and front point technique on slopes averaging 50 to 60 degrees. Fletcher departed Camp 2 at 6 a.m. with the group. Within a few hours, she had fallen 100 feet behind, her inefficient technique requiring excessive effort with each step. By mid-morning, she had stopped twice on small ledges to rest. Her pace slowed to roughly 50 feet every 15 minutes. At 12:30 p.m., at 23,400 feet, Fletcher began coughing. The fits continued and worsened with exertion. The guide radioed the expedition leader and recommended immediate descent to Camp 2. Fletcher refused, stating she had invested too much time and money to turn back during a training rotation. She stood and continued climbing. By 2:15 p.m., her coughing had intensified dramatically, stopping her every few steps. Pink-tinged frothy sputum appeared at the corners of her mouth. The guide recognized this as high-altitude pulmonary edema and radioed an emergency. Within minutes, Fletcher was unable to stand without support, her breathing wet and gurgling. The guide clipped a short tether from his harness to hers and began lowering her down the fixed line. At 2:40 p.m., Fletcher lost consciousness. The guide continued the descent for 30 minutes, making minimal progress against her dead weight on the steep face. Two Sherpas ascending from Camp 2 reached them at 3:10 p.m. The three worked together to move Fletcher down the Lhotse Face, alternating between lowering her on the rope and short roping across less steep sections. At 4:20 p.m., at 22,400 feet, one Sherpa checked for a pulse and found none. Her lips and face had turned bluish. They continued moving her body down to Camp 2, arriving at 6:50 p.m. exhausted. A guide with wilderness medical training confirmed she had died from pulmonary edema. The investigation reviewed Fletcher's performance records and contacted the mountaineering school listed on her application. The school confirmed she had completed only a weekend introductory course, not a comprehensive technical program. Her Colorado climbs were verified as standard hiking trails, requiring no ropes or crampons. Medical analysis concluded her poor technique forced her body to work 2 to 3 times harder than a skilled climber on the same terrain, triggering acute pulmonary edema. Her refusal to descend when symptoms first appeared at 12:30 p.m. eliminated the window when descent might have reversed the condition. It was April 3rd, 2019. The Khumbu icefall doesn't look like a death trap from a distance. From base camp, the Khumbu icefall looks beautiful, blue-white, ancient, almost inviting. But every serious climber knows it's always moving. You cross it fast, but carefully, because one rush step can mean you never come back down. Bianca Chaya didn't get that memo. By the time I started piecing together what happened on that mountain, the icefall was where most accounts began. Specifically, where people first started noticing that Bianca wasn't climbing Everest the way anyone else was. She was already treating it like a timed obstacle course, already arguing with her Sherpa team. Not about anchor placements or ice conditions, about pace, about what she kept calling wasted time. I think the obsession with speed on Everest is usually just disguised panic or ego. That phrase came up in account after account. Wasted time. It followed her up the mountain like a bad reputation. Bianca, 34, was a corporate performance consultant from Seattle who treated life like a spreadsheet. Smart, disciplined, and exhausting to be around, she believed most problems came down to inefficiency. To her, Everest wasn't a mountain. It was the ultimate performance test, something to beat, not survive. However, at base camp, the cracks started showing almost immediately. Acclimatization rotations, the structured process of ascending and descending in stages to let your body adjust to thinning oxygen, are not optional on Everest. They're a physiological necessity. Your blood literally needs time to thicken, to produce more red cells capable of carrying oxygen at elevations, where the air holds about a third of the oxygen available at sea level. Guides enforce rotation schedules because the mountain kills people who skip them, and it doesn't always kill them quickly or obviously. Sometimes it just makes them stupid, slower, and prone to bad decisions. Bianca pushed into Camp 1 ahead of schedule. When the expedition guides flagged the timing, she reportedly brushed it off. One of her Sherpas, a veteran with over a dozen Everest summits to his name, later told a fellow guide that she had looked at him during that conversation and said flatly that they're not here to sit around breathing thin air like tourists. The dining tent at base camp became its own kind of legend. Climbers from 3 other expeditions all remembered the same dinner. Bianca had complained loudly, not quietly, not in passing, but loudly, that the food portions were unreasonable given what the expedition cost. She demanded extra eggs while other climbers were still waiting for their first serving. When a staff member explained that supplies were rationed for upper camps and couldn't be redistributed freely, she snapped that she hadn't paid premium prices to eat like a backpacker. The whole tent went silent. People remembered it clearly months later. Not because it was the worst thing anyone had ever said at altitude, but because of the timing. Because everyone in that tent was about to go up the same mountain, breathe the same thin air, depend on the same ropes and the same support teams. And she had just made very clear how she saw the people around her. Not as teammates, not as fellow climbers, but as obstacles with a catering problem. Honestly, that's one of the most revealing ways to see someone's character under stress. After the chaos of the Khumbu icefall, the groaning ice, the ladder crossings, the constant low-level awareness that the ground beneath you was technically moving, the Western CWM felt almost peaceful. It was a wide, flat glacial valley cradled between the upper shoulders of Everest and Lhotse, shielded from wind by the surrounding ridgelines. On clear days, the sunlight bounced off the snow walls so intensely that climbers came back with sunburns on the undersides of their chins. It was the kind of place that made you forget briefly that you were already above 20,000 feet. Altitude sickness doesn't arrive dramatically. It creeps in. Headache, heavy legs, irritability, bad decisions disguised as confidence. Experienced climbers recognize it early and slow down, because at that altitude, pretending you're fine is often the first mistake. Bianca responded by doubling down on caffeine tablets and pushing her Sherpa team harder. By the time her group moved through the CWM toward Camp 2, her behavior had shifted from abrasive to genuinely disruptive. The verbal outbursts that had started as sharp comments at base camp had escalated into full confrontations. One climber from a separate expedition, who overlapped with her group for 2 days, described overhearing her yell at one of her Sherpas, a man named Wang Yal, experienced and well-regarded among the guiding community, that if he couldn't keep up, she'd find someone who could carry her faster. Wang Yal, by every account, said nothing back, just kept climbing. That restraint said more than anything else could have. She had taken to referring to scheduled rest periods as delays, which sounds like a minor semantic difference, until you understand what rest periods at altitude actually are. They weren't breaks in the recreational sense. They were oxygen checks, gear assessments, fluid intake windows. Guides built them into the schedule because the margin for error above 21,000 feet was nearly non-existent, and small problems, a loose crampon, early dehydration, an oxygen valve running lower than expected, became catastrophic problems very quickly if nobody stopped long enough to catch them. Bianca refused these pauses even when her lead guide insisted. She stood at the front of the group during stops with her poles planted, visibly impatient, sighing loudly in the cold air. Now, I'm no pro climber, but I think refusing rest at that altitude is basically refusing your own survival margin. She had also developed a habit of pacing ahead of her own group during rotations. Not by accident, she was deliberately outwalking the people she was supposed to be moving with, forcing her Sherpas to close the gap, re-establish rope security, recheck anchor connections she had blown past. From the outside, it probably looked like drive. From the inside of her team, it was a constant drain. Every rushed clip in, every skipped visual check, stacked risk on top of risk in a place where the stacking eventually became structural. Riku, another climber on a separate permit whose team briefly shared the route with hers, described a bottleneck near a fixed rope section where multiple groups had slowed to allow a safe single-file crossing. Bianca had apparently waited about 45 seconds before announcing loudly to no one in particular, "Move or get moved." Riku said she repeated it twice. Nobody moved faster. They just started avoiding eye contact with her. Honestly, I read that as pure entitlement. I don't see leadership there at all. Just someone trying to force control in a place that punishes ego immediately. The incident near the ladder crossing happened earlier, back in the icefall, but it kept coming up in conversations because it captured something specific about how she operated. A climber was still completing a crossing over a deep crevasse when Bianca stepped onto the same ladder from the opposite side. The ladder swayed. The descending climber froze. A guide called out for her to wait. She looked up and said, clearly and without hesitation, "This isn't kindergarten. Keep moving." People remembered it because you don't talk like that up there. Not because of some unwritten code of mountain etiquette, but because the person on that ladder with you is tethered into the same system you are. Their panic becomes your problem. Their slip becomes your emergency. The mountain is already trying to kill you. There's no bandwidth left for ego. The communal storage incident happened around this time too. Bianca had misplaced a glove liner and spent a loud, disruptive afternoon tearing through shared gear areas, accusing a kitchen worker by name of moving her things. Other climbers watched from a distance. The liner turned up later that day, clipped inside her own duffel exactly where she had packed it. There was no apology, not even a gesture toward one. She just zipped the bag, asked someone nearby for hot water, and moved on. Two separate climbers mentioned that incident specifically when recounting what she was like. Not the outbursts at Sherpas, not the ladder crossing, the glove, liner. Something about the smallness of it stuck with people. The guides who observed her during this phase noted something that the rest of us might have missed from the outside. She wasn't actually moving efficiently. She was burning energy at a rate that made her timelines mathematically impossible to sustain. All the rushing, the confrontations, the refusal to rest, these weren't saving her time. They were eating through her reserves in a place where reserves were everything. The climbers she was trying to outrun, the ones she dismissed as slow and overly cautious, were actually pacing themselves for an 8,000-meter peak. She was pacing herself for a boardroom sprint. From my perspective, this is classic self-sabotage. She wasn't racing the mountain. She was racing her own misunderstanding of it. The mountain at that point was already ahead of her. She was already dead, and she doesn't know it yet. Everest forecasts don't arrive as dramatic warnings. They spread quietly through radios, sat phones, and camp rumors. Experienced climbers watch patterns, not just numbers. Wind shifts, pressure changes, small signs that matter. Those subtle changes are what make good guides start rethinking summit plans. By the time Bianca's team reached Camp 3, those signals were already arriving. Camp 3 sat on the Lhotse face, a sweeping wall of blue glacial ice angled at roughly 50 degrees, fixed ropes running the length of it like stitching on a wound. It was not a comfortable place to stop. Tents had to be cut into the ice shelf with considerable effort, and sleeping there meant the constant awareness that you were essentially bolted to the side of a frozen cliff at 24,000 feet. The air held maybe a third of the oxygen available at sea level. Cognitive functions started degrading in measurable ways up there. Reaction time slowed, decision-making became unreliable, and the emotional regulation that kept people calm under pressure began to erode. Most climbers at Camp 3 got quieter, more deliberate, more willing to listen. However, Bianca got louder. The forecast changed during an evening briefing. The summit window was shrinking faster than expected. Strong teams immediately discussed delaying their push and waiting for conditions to stabilize. On Everest, conservative decisions aren't weakness, they're experience. When the possibility of a delay came up among the climbers gathered near the camp's shared radio point, Bianca's response was immediate. One climber, a Norwegian named Alexei, who had summited two other 8,000ers before attempting Everest, recalled her rolling her eyes before the guide had even finished his sentence. Then she said it, the line that spread through camp faster than the forecast update itself. "Some of us came here to summit, not attend weather seminars." Alexei told me he actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because he couldn't believe anyone said something like that at Camp 3. You're not on a corporate retreat at 24,000 feet. You're in a place where the weather doesn't adjust to your schedule. I honestly think that line is pure arrogance. It shows she saw caution as weakness, which is exactly how people get caught out there. After that, teams started actively maneuvering to avoid sharing rope sections with her group. The physical signs were visible by then to anyone paying attention. Altitude fatigue at Camp 3 and above wasn't hypothetical. It was present in almost every climber to some degree. The question was always how severe, and whether a person was managing it or ignoring it. Headaches were nearly universal. Slowed speech showed up in extended conversations. Mild disorientation, losing track of time, repeating questions, small lapses in memory, was common enough that guides were trained to watch for escalation rather than onset. At least 2 members of Bianca's climbing group were showing clear signs. One had been moving significantly slower over the past rotation and had mentioned a persistent headache that wasn't responding to hydration. Another had been quieter than usual in ways her tent mate found unsettling. These weren't people who needed to turn around necessarily, but they needed monitoring, and they needed the pace adjusted around their current state. Bianca encouraged them to match her speed. Her lead Sherpa, a man named Pasang, who had been on Everest 7 times and had turned around twice when conditions demanded it, which in guiding circles was considered a mark of good judgment rather than failure, advised her directly that the group needed a rest day before considering any further upward movement. He laid it out plainly. The forecast was shifting. 2 team members were symptomatic, and the summit push would be stronger after recovery time. She told him the mountain was overhyped danger-wise. That phrase, overhyped danger-wise, had apparently become something of a trademark by this point. She had said it at base camp, said it again in the western CWM, and now she was saying it at 24,000 feet on the Lhotse face with a deteriorating forecast and symptomatic teammates. Other expedition members had started repeating it to each other in the dry, exhausted way that people repeat things when they can't believe something is real. Pasang, according to a fellow guide he spoke with afterward, went quiet after she said it. Not angry quiet, just the kind of quiet that came from having nothing left to add. He had done his job. He had given her the information. The decision ultimately belonged to the permit holder, and Bianca Chayad had already decided. The summit push was still on. Delay was not a consideration. The weather advisories were suggestions, not constraints, and the people telling her otherwise were obstacles dressed up as experts. She started prepping her gear that night for the push to high camp. Storms on Everest start quietly. More wind, less visibility, snow drifting thicker by the hour. By the time people realize conditions have turned dangerous, they're already in it. The summit push began before dawn as usual, headlamps moving slowly upward, with the cold feeling less like weather and more like weight. Bianca was moving at the front of her group. That part wasn't unusual for her. What stood out was that other teams weren't on the same schedule. Alexi's group chose to hold at Camp 3 after morning radio updates confirmed the jet stream had moved in faster than expected. Within an hour, 2 other expeditions made the same call independently. No coordination, just shared data and the same conclusion. Bianca's group pushed anyway. For the first hour or so, conditions were uncomfortable but navigable. Wind was elevated but not yet dangerous. Visibility was reduced, but the fixed lines were still traceable. Pasang kept the group tight, calling back position checks more frequently than usual, shortening the interval between him and the climbers behind him. He was already compensating for what the forecast had told him was coming. Then, the wind shear hit. It didn't arrive as a single gust. It arrived as a sustained increase that kept climbing, 40 miles per hour, then higher, driving ice crystals horizontally across the slope in a way that made goggles nearly useless. The fixed lines were still there, but finding them required stopping, feeling along the surface, tracing the rope by hand rather than by sight. Movement slowed to a fraction of its earlier pace. Radio communication became difficult. The wind swallowed words before they could carry. Teams that were still on the mountain began clustering near anchor points, waiting for a break in the gusts, reassessing. This was instinct developed through experience. When visibility collapsed and wind made footing unpredictable, you stopped moving independently and you held position until you had enough information to move safely. Bianca broke from the cluster. She moved ahead, alone, into terrain that was no longer clearly visible. Pasang called after her. A second Sherpa tried to close the gap, but she had already put distance between herself and the group, and in those conditions, distance became something else entirely. Distance became isolation. In a whiteout, the fixed lines are the route. With no landmarks, the rope is the only thing separating safe ground from open mountain. Disconnecting between anchor sections normally takes seconds, but in a storm, exhausted and oxygen-starved, those seconds become dangerous. Bianca was now navigating those transitions alone, ahead of her rope team, in conditions that had pushed multiple experienced guides to stop moving entirely. From below, Pasang and the remaining group could no longer see her. Radio contact was broken up, fragmentary. One transmission came through, her voice wind distorted, saying something that sounded like she was still moving toward the high camp. Then, static. The fixed line that her last known position corresponded to ran along a steep mixed section, ice and exposed rock, the kind of terrain that demanded precise foot placement and careful weight distribution even in good conditions. In wind and reduced visibility, it was the kind of place where the margin between a secure step and an insecure one was measured in inches. Other climbers who were still in contact with their teams later described the same sensory experience from that window, the sense that the mountain had stopped being a physical space you were moving through and had become something ambient, something surrounding you completely without edges or orientation. One of them told me it was the first time on any climb he had felt genuinely unable to tell which direction was down. That was the mountain Bianca was alone in. Fatigue at extreme altitude doesn't feel like normal exhaustion. It's not just tiredness after effort, it's a gradual mental and physical breakdown. Thoughts stop linking cleanly, movements need deliberate control, and everything slows slightly out of sync. You only notice it after the gap between intention and action has already widened. By the time Bianca had separated from her group, that gap had been widening for hours. Pasang had seen it in her movement during the approach, the slight over-reliance on the rope for balance, the hesitation at anchor points where she had previously moved without pause. He had flagged it in a radio call to the expedition's base camp coordinator, using the measured language that experienced guides used when they wanted to communicate concern without triggering panic. There was nothing more to do from that distance. What happened next came together through two primary sources, a partial account from a Sherpa named Tenzin, who had been moving on a parallel section of the route with a separate team and caught fragments of what unfolded, and a more detailed account from a climber named Maren, a German mountaineer on her second Everest attempt, who had held her position at an anchor point roughly 40 meters below the critical section and observed portions of what occurred between gusts. Bianca was on the fixed line above the traverse when Maren first spotted her. She was moving, but slowly, the kind of slow that read as deliberate from a distance, but, Maren said, felt wrong when you watched it carefully. Her movements had a quality of overcorrection, each step slightly adjusted after landing, each clip-in taking longer than it should have. The section she was approaching was a steep mixed pitch, ice and exposed rock running at a sharp angle, the kind of terrain that separated technical climbers from aspirational ones. In good conditions, with proper rest and full oxygen, it was demanding but manageable. In the conditions that existed at that moment, wind, reduced visibility, compromised oxygen flow, and a body running on fumes it didn't have, it was the exact wrong place to be moving without a rope team. Tenzin's account described hearing her before he saw her. Her breathing was audible even through the wind, which at that altitude meant she was working at a respiratory rate that should have stopped her 20 minutes earlier. Then came the transition point. Between two anchor sections, there was a short gap, maybe 6 feet of terrain, where a climber had to unclip from one fixed line, cross a narrow ledge, and clip into the next anchor before continuing. It was a standard maneuver, documented in every briefing, practiced on lower sections during acclimatization. The technique required clipping into the new anchor before releasing the old one, maintaining continuous connection to the safety system throughout the transfer. Bianca unclipped from the first anchor before securing the second. The exact reason wasn't something anyone could say with certainty. Fatigue affecting fine motor sequencing, a momentary lapse in the cognitive checklist that altitude had been quietly erasing for hours, possibly a belief in that oxygen-starved moment that the transfer was shorter than it was. Whatever the calculation was, it was wrong. For a few seconds, she was standing on that ledge with no connection to the fixed line system at all. Maren said she saw it happen and understood immediately what she was seeing. She said she opened her mouth but didn't make a sound, the way you sometimes couldn't when something moved faster than your ability to respond to it. The gust that hit the section wasn't the largest of the day. Tenzin estimated it at somewhere between 50 and 60 miles per hour, which on that slope, on that ledge, with no anchor connection and compromised footing on wind-loaded ice, was more than enough. Bianca's balance went first, a sideways lean that her body tried to correct and couldn't. Her poles made contact with the ice once, the sound audible even through the wind, according to Tenzin, and then she was gone. Not gradually, not with any of the drawn-out struggle that people sometimes imagined when they thought about falls on mountains. Just there, and then not there, the storm closing over the space she had occupied as if it had been waiting. Maren held her anchor point and did not move for a long time afterward. The calls started going out within minutes. Pasang was already moving toward her last known position when a gust slowed everything further. At At the anchor point, he saw the line unclipped on the approach side and knew what had likely happened before he even looked. He radioed base camp in short, controlled phrases, managing both the situation and his own reaction at the same time. Attempts to locate her immediately were impossible due to visibility collapse. Recovery efforts were delayed by weather conditions that made movement unsafe even for experienced Sherpas. Teams could not safely descend into the section she fell from until conditions partially cleared. No usable body recovery was completed. The terrain and storm conditions made it impractical and dangerous. Looking at the full picture, it's hard to frame this as anything other than a predictable outcome of a mindset that treated a highly technical, high-fatality environment like a performance dashboard. She didn't just ignore risk, she consistently reframed it as incompetence in everyone else. And up there, that kind of thinking doesn't get corrected in real time. It compounds until the mountain forces the correction itself. If there's any takeaway from her climb, it's that confidence without restraint on Everest isn't leadership or ambition. It's just a liability that eventually drags everyone around it into the consequences. It was June 27, 2017, at Angel's Landing, where the final approach required hikers to navigate a narrow sandstone ridge, 5,790 feet above sea level, exposed on both sides with only partial chains for protection. Maribel Quent, 34, owned a boutique clothing store in San Diego and frequently shared curated travel photos online. Though she had moderate hiking experience, her focus was more on capturing the perfect shot than following safety rules. From what I see, her priority wasn't the summit, it was the photograph. The final half mile of the trail is a narrow ridge with drop-offs exceeding 1,000 feet. By midday, temperatures had climbed to around 95 degrees Fahrenheit. The sandstone surfaces were polished from years of foot traffic, with smooth areas made even more slippery by a thin layer of sand blown across the trail by the wind. Chains were available in some of the most exposed sections, but large portions of the ridge remained unprotected, relying entirely on hikers' judgment and careful movement. Even under normal conditions, this ridge can be unforgiving. Add a layer of loose sand and heat, and one misstep is all it takes. Signs posted along the trail warned hikers to stay on the designated path and avoid venturing onto unprotected ledges. Rangers that morning had briefed visitors on recent incidents involving photographers stepping off trail. Maribel had heard the warnings, but dismissed them as excessive. She moved beyond the chain several times to adjust for better shots, shifting her stance and testing the edges to get the right angle. From where I'm looking, it probably seemed harmless to her at the time. But on a narrow, exposed ridge like that, every extra step onto unstable ground made an accident far more likely. As she neared the summit, she spotted a ledge about 8 feet beyond the official trail that promised a clear, unobstructed view of the valley below. From a distance, it looked stable, but it was sloped and covered in loose sand. Maribel stepped past the boundary rope and moved toward the ledge, testing each foot placement carefully, but missing how the surface could shift beneath her. Her camera bag, weighing roughly 12 pounds, subtly shifted her center of gravity, forcing her to lean forward slightly to maintain balance. Here, you can see how even a small shift in weight or footing can completely change your stability. Those few extra pounds made the difference. Sandstone beneath her was smooth, with almost no texture to grip. As she adjusted for the photo, her right foot began to slide on the sand. She tried to correct, but instead accelerated the movement. Her hands reached for a hold, but the smooth rock offered nothing to grab. Within seconds, she was sliding uncontrollably toward the edge. Momentum carried her over the precipice. Witnesses reported she disappeared from view almost instantly. The fall was estimated at roughly 1,000 feet. That moment is almost impossible to stop once it begins. One slip and gravity takes over. It's a brutal reminder of how thin the line is between safe and fatal. Other hikers immediately alerted park rangers via emergency communications. Immediate rescue was impossible due to the exposed terrain, so recovery waited until conditions allowed a helicopter later that afternoon. Death was confirmed as instantaneous from blunt force trauma, with contributing factors including leaving the trail unstable, footing, and extra weight from her camera. It's striking how fast it happened. A few missteps off the trail, and that was enough. Everything else just made it worse. The incident received little public attention, noted only in seasonal park reports, serving as a reminder that even routine hikes can turn fatal when safety boundaries are ignored. Looking back, the decision to prioritize a photograph over safety stands out clearly. It's easy to think you can handle this, but the mountain doesn't negotiate. That's what makes incidents like this so sobering. The consequences arrive before you even realize the danger. It was May 23, 2018, on the upper flanks of a peak in the Khumbu region of Nepal, where the summit ridge sits above 27,000 feet, and the atmosphere holds roughly one-third the oxygen available at sea level. A place where the human body does not survive so much as it slowly stops functioning. Denise Carreau was 41 years old and worked as a structural engineer for a mid-size infrastructure firm based in Portland, Oregon. She had spent 11 years assembling what looked like a strong mountaineering resume on paper, but much of it consisted of guided climbs where she leaned heavily on others while presenting herself as the most knowledgeable person in the group. She frequently argued with guides, questioned route decisions, and dismissed safety briefings as overly cautious. However, I do think that she was not reckless in her own mind. She simply believed she knew better than everyone else. Her colleagues described her as someone who triple-checked load calculations and kept a laminated checklist taped to her desk. And she carried that same attitude onto the mountain, correcting others and inserting herself into decisions she wasn't qualified to make. She had trained for this specific climb for 3 years. Altitude acclimatization rotations, supplemental oxygen drills, and 2 preparatory Himalayan expeditions in prior seasons, both of which included documented disagreements with guides over pacing and oxygen use. Her stated turnaround time was 2 p.m., the hard cutoff enforced by most experienced guides operating at extreme altitude. What investigators would later piece together is that she summited at approximately 1:45 p.m., 15 minutes ahead of the cutoff. That detail matters. It likely gave her a sense of margin she did not actually have. Descending climbers who passed her reported she was moving efficiently on the way up, but had lingered near the top longer than expected, resting, adjusting gear. By the time she turned around, it was past 2:30 p.m. Her supplemental oxygen canister, based on the flow rate logged by her guide team at base camp, had less than 90 minutes of supply remaining. Above 26,000 feet, what climbers refer to as the death zone, the human body cannot acclimatize. Cells begin dying faster than they regenerate. Cognitive function degrades within hours. Coordination, judgment, and fine motor. Control collapse in sequence, often before the person experiencing the decline is aware of it. Wind on the upper ridge that afternoon was measured at roughly 35 miles per hour with gusts near 50. Air temperature had dropped to approximately minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill pushing it closer to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. At that altitude, muscles fail under exertion that would be trivial at sea level, and the brain begins making calculations it is no longer capable of completing correctly. At approximately 3:10 p.m., a descending rope team spotted Denise near the upper ridge. A climber named Haruki, part of a separate expedition, later gave a detailed account to investigators. He described her pace as reduced to small, dragging steps, crampons scraping rather than planting, her upper body pitching forward with each movement. She was not stopping to rest. She was simply unable to move faster. Haruki said her oxygen mask was still on, but the canister gauge visible from several meters away appeared to read empty. By 4 p.m., she had descended less than 300 feet from where the rope team first spotted her. Then, she went down. Haruki described her collapsing sideways against the slope, not falling, but folding. One knee first, then her hip, then her shoulder. She tried to push herself upright repeatedly, arms shaking violently with the effort. And each time she reached a partial upright position, she came back down. Her breathing had become audible from several meters away, a high-pitched wheeze carried on the wind, a sound Haruki said he had not heard from a person before. Her oxygen ran out completely sometime around 4:15 p.m. Without supplemental flow, deterioration accelerated. Frost began forming along the edges of her goggles and across her eyelashes, as well as on her eyebrows and the hair visible beneath her helmet. Her skin, exposed at the jaw and chin, had taken on a grayish, waxy tone that Haruki noted explicitly in his account. I've read a lot of accounts like this, and the image of frost forming over someone's eyes while they're still technically alive is something that doesn't leave you. Her eyes remained partially open. Haruki attempted to connect his own oxygen line to her mask, but her responsiveness had already faded to the point where she could not grip or assist the connection. She settled into a semi-curled position on the slope, one hand still gripping the webbing of her harness. Her breathing slowed to shallow, irregular intervals. Then it stopped. Haruki radioed base camp at approximately 4:40 p.m. A rescue team from the expedition's high camp attempted to reach her position, but was turned back by deteriorating wind conditions. They reached her body the following morning. The coroner's report, translated and summarized for the family, listed the cause of death as hypoxic respiratory failure compounded by hypothermia, with contributing factors including physical exhaustion and altitude-induced cognitive impairment. No equipment malfunction was identified. Everything functioned as designed. She simply ran out of time and oxygen in that order. Denise Carreau's body was recovered 2 days later and transported to base camp. Her family declined a public memorial. Haruki gave his full account to investigators and has not spoken publicly since. Climbers who crossed her path remembered the same pattern: confidence that bordered on entitlement, a refusal to follow guidance, and a tendency to treat safety limits as optional. The 45 minutes she spent at the summit were not an accident. They were a decision shaped by that mindset. At that altitude, that difference is fatal. It was May 3, 2017, on the standard southeast ridge route of Mount Everest. Camp 3 clung to the steep Lhotse face at 24,000 feet, a collection of tents anchored to ice ledges carved into the 50-degree slope. Claudia Beverly, 49, was part of a commercial expedition and had paid for a premium package that included dedicated Sherpa support and customized services. She worked in wealth management and had completed one previous high-altitude climb on Mount Kilimanjaro, which required no technical skills or supplemental oxygen. Beverly mentioned frequently that her premium fee entitled her to personalized attention and scheduling flexibility that standard packages did not include. During the 3-week acclimatization period, Beverly requested modifications to the climbing schedule, including later departure times and extended breakfast periods with specific meal preparations requiring separate cooking. When the expedition leader explained that everyone ate the same meals at the same time for efficiency, Beverly pointed to her package's mention of customized service. The guides accommodated her requests when possible, though this required her personal Sherpa to prepare food separately. Beverly also requested longer rest stops during climbs. During the ascent from Camp 1 to Camp 2, she stopped 6 times, each time resting for 10 to 15 minutes, causing the group to arrive at Camp 2 nearly 2 hours behind the main team. When the expedition leader noted that extended delays could create problems during the summit push, Beverly maintained she was managing her energy appropriately and understood her own physical limits. On May 2nd, the expedition leader announced a weather window opening May 4th, with summit attempts departing Camp 4 around midnight. He emphasized that all climbers needed to maintain group pace for safe descent before afternoon weather deterioration. Beverly approached him privately to argue that her premium package entitled her to climb at her own pace with dedicated Sherpa support. The leader explained that no exceptions were possible above Camp 4. Beverly did not raise the issue again, but remained visibly dissatisfied. On May 3rd, the team arrived at the South Col at 2:30 p.m. with plans to depart at 11 p.m. During the rest period, Beverly made multiple requests to her Sherpa for hand warmers, specific snacks, and adjustments to her oxygen setup, each requiring equipment to be unpacked and repacked. When the guide called for departure at 10:45 p.m., Beverly emerged 15 minutes late. The team left at 11:10 p.m., already behind schedule. Beverly climbed slowly from the start, stopping frequently. The team reached the balcony at 5:20 a.m., 50 minutes behind the planned schedule. After a brief rest, the group resumed at 5:25 a.m. Beverly stood 4 minutes later and followed. At 8:50 a.m., the team reached 28,400 feet, with the summit 600 feet above. The guide radioed base camp, and the decision was made to continue with a firm 11:30 a.m. turnaround. At 9:15 a.m., Beverly sat down on the fixed line, despite instructions to maintain pace. The guide helped her to her feet after 3 minutes. The team reached the summit at 10:45 a.m. Beverly spent 8 minutes at the top, while her Sherpa photographed her. Other team members had already begun descending after 2 to 3 minutes. She started down at 10:55 a.m. Her pace slowed immediately. The 300-foot stretch between the summit and South Summit took 75 minutes, with Beverly stopping 6 times on the fixed next line. By 1:40 p.m., the team was at 27,800 feet, with winds at 30 miles per hour and temperature falling to minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Beverly sat down and could not continue under her own power. The guide instructed the Sherpas to short rope her, keeping a shortened length of rope between Beverly and a Sherpa to physically control her movement down the slope. At 3:50 p.m., at 27,200 feet, Beverly collapsed and could not stand even with assistance. Two Sherpas managed to move her approximately 50 feet over 20 minutes before progress became impossible. With darkness less than 90 minutes away and the team still 1,200 feet above camp, the guide established an emergency bivouac at a small rock outcrop at 27,150 feet. At 5:10 p.m., Beverly became unresponsive. Wind gusts reached 45 miles per hour, and temperature dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Her breathing stopped at 5:45 p.m. The guide and Sherpas descended through darkness using headlamps, reaching Camp 4 at 8:20 p.m., with frostbite injuries to their extremities. Beverly's body was recovered on May 8th when conditions improved. The investigation determined death from severe hypothermia and exhaustion, concluding that her cumulative delays, totaling roughly 2.5 hours beyond a standard ascent, placed the team in an unrecoverable position as daylight and oxygen supplies ran out simultaneously. The report noted that the Sherpas and guide who remained with Beverly sustained serious frostbite injuries as a direct consequence of the extended time spent above 27,000 feet attempting to assist her descent. It was April 15th, 2023, and let me be upfront about something before I get into this story. I cover a lot of mountain deaths on this channel. Avalanches, altitude sickness, whiteout storms, equipment failures, things that can kill even the most experienced climbers on the planet. Those are tragedies. This one is something else. This is a story about a woman who had every possible advantage, every resource that money could buy, and she methodically dismantled all of it, one decision at a time, while other people watched and begged her to stop. Her name was Cressida Vane. Mid-30s, ran a life, coaching brand online. Very big on words like sovereignty and unbothered and no one controls my timeline. She sold courses with titles like Dominate Your Reality and Stop Asking Permission. Her whole identity was structured around the idea that she answered to nobody, that hesitation was weakness, and that any external limit placed on her was either jealousy or incompetence from whoever was doing the placing. That framework worked fine when she was selling digital products from a home office in Scottsdale. It had no business being on Mount Everest. Cressida had paid $600,000 for a full-service guided Everest expedition. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. $600,000. That's not a deposit. That's not a down payment. That's the complete package. Personal Sherpa, supplemental oxygen, fixed rope access, high-altitude tents at each camp, a full base camp support team, satellite weather forecasting, and medical personnel on standby. This was the most thorough, most supported, most safety-wrapped version of climbing Everest that money can purchase. She had hired an expedition company with an excellent safety record, and they had assigned her their best. However, she had no real mountaineering background. A few weekends of guided hiking in the Colorado Rockies, some time at an indoor climbing gym, a trip to Kilimanjaro the previous year, which she documented extensively on her platform, where multiple sources from that expedition later said she'd complained constantly about the pace. But Everest was next. She'd announced it publicly, built anticipation around it, and she was going. Her personal Sherpa was a man named Dorje Lama, 14 Everest summits, 22 years guiding clients in the Himalayas. He had seen every kind of weather this mountain could produce, and every kind of client this industry could generate. He was known among other guides as someone with exceptional patience and a calm that didn't break under pressure. He had kept nervous clients safe. He had kept reckless clients safe. He was about to meet someone who was going to test the outer limits of what any guide could actually do when a client simply refused to be guided. I want to give you a sense of what Everest actually is before I go further, because the scale of it matters for everything that comes after. Mount Everest sits on the border of Nepal and Tibet, and its summit is at 29,032 feet above sea level. At that altitude, the air contains roughly a third of the oxygen available at sea level. Your body cannot function normally up there. Acclimatization, the process of slowly ascending, allowing your blood to adapt, then descending before going higher, is not a suggestion. It is the biological requirement for not dying. Between base camp and Camp 1 sits the Khumbu Icefall. This is the most unpredictable section of the entire route. It's a slow-moving river of ice that cracks and shifts constantly. Enormous blocks called seracs, some of them the size of a 3-story building, tilt and collapse without warning. Crevasses cut through the surface, some shallow enough to step across, some so deep that recovery is not possible. The route through the icefall is maintained by a team of Sherpas called the Icefall Doctors, who spend the pre-season setting ladders horizontally across crevasses so climbers can cross them. These ladders flex underfoot. The whole thing requires total focus and absolute discipline with rope management. Cressida arrived at base camp after the helicopter ride from Kathmandu and immediately began making a list of problems. The tent wasn't spacious enough. The food wasn't what she'd expected. The altitude gave her a headache, which she announced loudly to people nearby as though the mountain owed her an apology for existing at 17,600 feet. Other climbers in the vicinity later described her arrival in terms that were politely damning. She was loud, she was demanding, she moved through. Camp like she was checking into a hotel and finding it wanting. Base camp itself is not a comfortable place by any standard. It sits on the Khumbu Glacier, which means the ground beneath your tent is literally moving ice. The rocks are loose and uneven. The air is already thin enough that most people feel winded walking uphill at a normal pace. The tents are designed for function, windproof, insulated, built to handle conditions that would destroy anything you'd buy at a sporting goods store. They are not spacious. Nobody who has spent time at Everest Base Camp has ever described it as roomy. This was not a failure of the expedition company. This was the mountain. But Cressida spent the better part of her first afternoon cataloging inadequacies, asking camp staff questions that had no good answers, and being loud about all of it in an environment where people generally try to conserve both energy and noise. One of the climbers I was able to connect with through expedition accounts and a later podcast appearance was a man named Praxedes Okafor, Nigerian-British veteran climber, on his third attempt at Everest. He said that within the first hour of Cressida being at base camp, he already felt a specific kind of dread. The kind you get when you can see exactly how something is going to go wrong and you have no power to stop it. He said she reminded him of the type of person who complains about turbulence on a plane, like the aircraft owes them a smoother experience and the pilots are somehow falling short. Doria met with her that first evening and laid out the plan thoroughly. He explained the rotation schedule. He explained why acclimatization worked the way it did. In plain language, no jargon. He explained rope protocols. He explained why you never unclip from the fixed lines in certain terrain. He was thorough, patient, and completely clear. Cressida listened for a while and then told him she felt the schedule was overly conservative, that she was in excellent shape, and that she'd appreciate it if they could move at a more ambitious pace. Dorja told her he understood, and that they would revisit the plan in the morning once she'd slept at altitude. She did not sleep well. Nobody sleeps well their first nights at altitude. Your brain keeps waking you up because the oxygen is lower than it's used to, and your body doesn't quite trust it. This is normal. Cressida, however, came to breakfast and framed it as another failing of the expedition setup. She picked at the food without eating much of it, making a point of looking around at the dining setup like it personally offended her. The altitude headache and shallow sleep were, in her mind, not physiological responses, but evidence that something about the accommodations was substandard. She fixated on the thin walls of the tent, the way voices carried in the early hours, the timing of wake-up calls, the temperature of the tea. Every small discomfort was cataloged and mentally reassigned as negligence. Instead of adjusting her expectations, she reframed normal acclimatization symptoms as proof that the guides were either cutting corners or didn't know what they were doing. She brought it up to anyone within earshot, not as a question, but as a running critique, comparing what she was experiencing to what she believed she had paid for. The cost of the expedition came up repeatedly in her reasoning, as if the number itself should have insulated her from altitude sickness, poor sleep, or basic environmental exposure. She linked unrelated inconveniences together, building a narrative where the entire operation felt disorganized and beneath her standards. Even the pacing plan for the day was folded into her complaints, interpreted as overly cautious rather than medically necessary. When the guides attempted to explain acclimatization, she treated it as deflection rather than expertise. She watched them closely, looking for inconsistencies, and repeated her grievances later with added certainty, as if repetition made them more legitimate. By the end of breakfast, the discomfort itself had taken a back seat to the idea that she was being shortchanged, and that perception shaped how she approached every instruction that followed. The first rotation through the Khumbu icefall happened 2 days later, after rest and observation. This initial passage is largely about getting a feel for the terrain, learning how the ladders move, how to manage your crampons on ice, and how to read the rope. Cressida's issue was pace. Dorje set a measured rhythm, slow, deliberate, conserving oxygen and energy while reading the ice ahead for signs of instability. She found this intolerable. She made it known in real time, complaining audibly while still mid-route, which is its own kind of problem because it burns oxygen faster and distracts the people around you who need to be focused on their footing. At one point, she stopped in the middle of a ladder, crossing, paused on a 3-rung aluminum ladder, suspended horizontally across a crevasse, over nothing, with her full body weight on metal rungs that flexed as she moved, and turned back to argue about the speed. The ladder swayed slightly when she turned. Dorje told her calmly to finish the crossing first. Then they would talk. She finished. The conversation that followed went nowhere. Back at base camp that night, she described the icefall as exhilarating, which, to be fair, it is, and then described her guide as overly cautious and controlling in a way that was holding back her experience. As the expedition continued its rotation schedule over the next week and a half, the dynamic between Cressida and Dorje deteriorated steadily. She started arriving late to morning briefings, which are not optional social gatherings. They contain weather updates, route changes, and safety information that is directly relevant to whether you survive the day. She argued about her oxygen equipment, kept adjusting the mask in ways that reduced its effectiveness, insisted it was uncomfortable, and treated Dorje's corrections as an attack rather than instruction. She raised the idea of accelerating the schedule on at least 4 separate occasions. Each time, Dorje explained why that was not possible in terms a high schooler could follow. Each time, she heard it as a personal limitation he was projecting onto her. During one of these conversations at Camp Wari, Dorje took the time to explain altitude sickness in detail. He described high-altitude pulmonary edema, HAPE, which is what happens when fluid starts building up in your lungs from ascending too fast. He described high-altitude cerebral edema, HACE, which is what happens when your brain swells. He explained that both conditions could kill her within hours if they developed far enough from a descent route. Cressida listened to this explanation and said she appreciated the information but felt confident her fitness level put her in a different category. Dorje said carefully that no amount of fitness changed the biology of oxygen deprivation. She said she understood. What made it worse was the social component. She had decided, somewhere along the way, that if Dorje wasn't going to help her move faster, she would find allies among the other climbers. She started approaching people at mealtimes and during rest periods, framing Dorje as obstructive, asking if others felt their guides were being too cautious, dropping comments about how much she'd paid and what that should mean. Other climbers mostly listened politely and then avoided her. Nobody wanted that energy on a mountain where your mental state directly affects your physical performance. There is a culture at base camp and in the camps above it, a kind of shared understanding that you are all in something serious together, that small dramas stay small, that the mountain demands a certain seriousness from everyone present. Cressida had not picked up on this culture. She operated like she was at a networking event, where the goal was to win people to her side. She made a particular target of Tero Lind, a Finnish structural engineer who was quietly working toward his second summit. She told him she was considering filing a formal complaint against Dorje for being obstructive and asked if Tero had experienced anything similar with his guide. Tero said no, that his guide had given him the same rules, and that those rules were the same rules every guide on this mountain gave every client, and that Dorje had 14 summits and was one of the most respected people at high altitude working today. Cressida scoffed at him. The following morning, she stood in front of 3 other climbers and accused Dorje directly of deliberately slowing the expedition because he wanted to see her fail, that he was intimidated by her drive and sabotaging her summit attempt out of professional jealousy. The 3 climbers said nothing. Dorje's response was quiet and direct. His only goal on this mountain was to get her to the top and back alive, and everything he did was in service of that. She told him she'd evaluate his performance at the end of the climb. Praxedes was nearby for part of this exchange. He later said it was one of the more uncomfortable things he'd witnessed on a mountain, and that's saying something, given what Everest produces. The third rotation pushed the team through the upper section of the Khumbu icefall again, this time aiming to push to Camp 1 and begin the progression toward Camp 2. This particular stretch, roughly between 19,000 and 20,000 feet, had shifted overnight. The icefall doctors had been out early to reassess and re-anchor a section of fixed rope that had pulled loose when a nearby serac settled. Dorja made note of this at the morning briefing and said the pace through this zone would be slower than previous rotations because the terrain was actively unstable. He explained what that meant practically. The surface you were standing on the last time could look slightly different today. Snow bridges that held last week might be thinner, and the footing required attention the entire way through. He said it plainly, without drama, because that was how Dorja communicated, like someone delivering a weather report rather than trying to scare anyone. He made direct eye contact with Cressida when he said that everyone stayed clipped to the fixed lines at all times in this section. He paused slightly on the word, everyone. She rolled her eyes. Taro saw it. Praxedes saw it. Dorje saw it, finished the briefing, and led the team out. The traverse, a horizontal crossing across the face of the glacier, came about 40 minutes into the climb. The path was narrow, maybe 3 feet of packed snow, with the mountain wall rising on one side and a crevasse field falling away on the other. The fixed ropes ran the length of it. Everyone was clipped in. The climber directly in front of Cressida was moving with the careful, deliberate steps that this kind of terrain demanded, testing each placement before shifting weight. Cressida felt this was too slow. She said so loudly in the middle of the traverse. The climber in front of her didn't respond and didn't speed up. Doria, behind her, told her to maintain her spacing and keep moving at the current pace. She said something back about being trapped between incompetence. He told her again to stay in line. She said she wasn't going to spend her entire expedition being jerked around by people she was paying. And then she unclipped from the fixed line. I want to pause on this, because it's the moment everything hinges on. Unclipping from the fixed line on a traverse above a crevasse field is not a bold decision. It is not a demonstration of capability or independence or confidence. It is the removal of the one thing that separates you from an uncontrolled fall into terrain from which recovery may be physically impossible. Dorje told her immediately to clip back in. She told him she was fine. He raised his voice, which was, by all accounts from witnesses, extremely rare for him, and said, "Clip in right now." She turned to face him on a 3-foot-wide trail above open ice and told him that she had paid more for this expedition than he would earn in a decade, that she was done being treated like she didn't know what she was doing, and that, if he couldn't support her climb, instead of obstructing it, she would finish without him. Other rope teams nearby had slowed. People were watching. Nobody intervened because it wasn't their place and there was nowhere to go. This was a narrow traverse. The mountain wall on one side, the crevasse field on the other, the trail in the middle. Some climbers later said they held their breath during the argument, not just because of the tension, but because she was standing unclipped on a traverse and every second she wasn't moving carefully was a second something could go wrong. Cressida turned back toward the direction of travel. She had made her decision. Her expression, according to one of the climbers who had a clear view, was not scared. It was not even reckless. It was satisfied, like she had finally said what needed saying, and now she was going to show everyone what she could do. She took a step forward, past the climber in front of her. She was moving with the same fast, stomping energy she'd been carrying since the first day at base camp. Like speed would settle the argument. She took another step, off the packed trail, onto the surface beside it. She took a third step. The snow gave way. It took less than a second. The surface she stepped onto looked like the same surface everyone else was standing on. It was a snow bridge, a thin layer of ice and compacted snow that had formed over an open crevasse, hiding the void beneath it. Experienced climbers learned to read the subtle signs of these slight color differences in the snow, a faintly hollow sound when you tap with your pole, the way the surface sags fractionally under pressure before it fails. These are things you learn from training, from mentors, from years of building a library of what the mountain looks like when it's about to hurt you. She had not been given the time to build that library. She had paid for an experienced person to read those signs on her behalf, and she had walked away from him. She stepped directly onto the snow bridge, her full body weight committed, and it collapsed. She dropped. Witnesses said they heard a short, sharp sound. Not a scream, just something sudden and brief. And then nothing. Just wind and the distant creak of glacier ice, and the specific silence that falls over a group of people who have just watched something happen that cannot be undone. Dorji was at the edge within seconds, calling her name. Nothing came back. He assessed the lip of the crevasse. The snow. Around the edge was shifting, undermined by the same collapse that had taken her, and approaching without a rope anchor would risk a second fall. He signaled the team to hold position. He keyed his radio. The response from base camp came fast. The rescue team that mobilized included Sherpa climbers with ropes, anchor equipment, and medical gear. Praxedes later said the professionalism of the rescue response was one of the things that stayed with him. How quickly the team organized, how calm everyone remained, how efficiently they worked through the problem. Cressida had no rope. There was no anchor point from her to the surface. The team knew approximately where she had gone, and from the position of her glove and the witness accounts. The surrounding ice was continuing to shift. Sending a person down without a properly established anchor system would risk losing someone else. The team worked methodically, setting anchors, calculating angles, rigging descent ropes. Her glove was found at the edge, just past the packed trail. That was the marker. That told them exactly where she had stepped off the safe line. Everything beyond that point was ice and silence. The recovery operation was suspended that afternoon. The crevasse depth, combined with the angle of the walls and the instability of the surrounding terrain, made continued attempts too dangerous to the rescuers. This is a reality that everyone who climbs Everest understands before they go. At a certain point, when the risk to those attempting a recovery exceeds what can be justified, the operation stops. It is brutal. It is also the only rational choice available. Cressida Vane did not come back off the glacier. The expedition was stood down. Climbers descended to base camp. Statements were collected. Her family was notified through official channels. The expedition company issued a release confirming the incident and extending condolences. The machinery of tragedy and paperwork ground through its motions. She spent $600,000 trying to be the one person on that mountain who operated on her own terms. She spent 2 weeks systematically rejecting every protocol, every warning, every instruction from the one man who had more high-altitude knowledge than she could have absorbed in a lifetime. Dorji Lama had 14 summits. He had kept dozens of clients safe across more than 2 decades on this mountain. He was, not to put too fine a point on it, exactly the resource she needed and exactly the person she treated as an obstacle. Everest is the kind of place where the systems exist specifically because the mountain does not forgive. It doesn't care about your brand, your price tag, your follower count, or your personal philosophy about sovereignty and self-determination. The fixed line is clipped. You stay in formation. You trust the person who has been here 14 times before. Cressida had everything. Every advantage, every resource, every layer of support. And she chose to see all of it as a cage instead of a lifeline. The mountain didn't take her. She walked herself to the edge of a crevasse and stepped off it alone. That's the part that stays with me. It was April 22nd, 2014, in the lower Khumbu icefall on Mount Everest, around 19,500 feet. This section is one of the most dangerous on the route, with shifting ice towers, hidden crevasses, and thin snow bridges. Temperatures range from -5 degrees Fahrenheit to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, but wind and exposure made it feel much colder. Every step required careful footing, balance, and reliable gear. Lenora Svek, 39, worked as a fashion buyer in New York City and approached the climb like she did her career, focused on style and appearance. Her experience was limited to guided climbs of Mount Washington and Mount Whitney, where mistakes were minor inconveniences. On Everest, she prioritized how gear looked and felt over its functionality. I could already see this was going to be a problem. The mountain doesn't care about style, only what works. The icefall demanded specialized equipment, insulated gloves, heavy base layers, and full-body protection against sudden cold and exposure. Lenora had opted for lighter alternatives, arguing that bulk would slow her down. Her gloves were designed for moderate cold, not the sustained freezing conditions of the icefall. That morning, guides ran their routine equipment check and again recommended she switch to heavier gear. She refused. I get wanting to move faster or feel more comfortable, but in this environment, comfort isn't really the goal, survival is. Within the first hour, the consequences of her choices became apparent. She stopped frequently to adjust her layers and warm her hands, which were already showing signs of reduced circulation. Each pause slowed the team and increased exposure to unstable ice. Small issues start to stack up fast in places like this. That's how serious accidents begin. One minor misstep, then another, until it's too late. Lenora approached a ladder spanning a 40-foot crevasse. Her gloves had lost warmth, leaving fingers numb. Halfway across, she slipped, her right foot between rungs and left hand off the rail. Her harness caught her, but she fell partially into the crevasse. Still, her body slammed against the ice wall with enough force to fracture several ribs and inflict internal injuries. One small slip doesn't stay small in the ice fall. The mountain turns minor mistakes into major consequences almost instantly. She was left suspended, unable to pull herself out. Her numb fingers made it impossible to assist in her own rescue. The team began a rope extraction, but the surrounding ice was unstable, and setting up safely took time. Every minute mattered as her injuries and exposure worsened. Hypothermia set in quickly without proper insulation. It's easy to underestimate how fast the cold drains you when movement is limited and adrenaline can't protect you anymore. The team eventually managed to extract her, but her condition was critical. She was unresponsive, and attempts to stabilize her were limited by the terrain. The expedition's medical officer later confirmed the cause of death as internal injuries compounded by severe hypothermia, with contributing factors including inadequate protective gear and reduced dexterity from cold exposure. The warnings were clear early on, and the contributing factors were present before the incident. The incident was included in the season's climbing reports, emphasizing the vital role of proper equipment. One small detail, like gloves, ended up being a huge factor. Up here, there is no margin for error, no second chances. The icefall remained as treacherous as ever after the accident. The mountain didn't change. The risks stayed exactly the same. And that's the thing about climbing Everest. It doesn't negotiate, it doesn't adjust. It's unforgiving, and it doesn't care about your priorities or how much money you spent. Lenora's death demonstrated how personal preference and underestimating environmental hazards can have fatal consequences, especially when combined with technical terrain and extreme cold. It's sobering to realize that a decision as small as lighter gloves or an easier outfit could set off a chain of events that no one can reverse once it starts. It was May 20th, 2014, in the death zone above Camp 4 on Mount Everest. The South Col stretched flat and windswept at 26,000 feet, a barren expanse of rock and ice wedged between Everest and Lhotse. Felicia Holt, 44, ran a yoga and wellness studio and had hired a guide service for her second attempt at Everest after turning back the previous year due to weather. She had been practicing high-altitude breathing techniques for months, and mentioned frequently that her cardiovascular conditioning would compensate for her limited technical climbing experience. During training rotations, she demonstrated pranayama breathing exercises to other climbers and explained how controlled breathing could reduce oxygen consumption at altitude. On May 19th, the expedition leader briefed the team on the summit window, a narrow 18-hour period of light winds starting at midnight, followed by an incoming storm. He emphasized a strict 11 a.m. turnaround regardless of summit status. Holt questioned why their cutoff was earlier than other expeditions and whether strong climbers could push past it. The leader repeated that all clients would descend at 11 a.m. without exception. That evening, Holt learned from climbers on other teams that 2 expeditions were targeting a 1 p.m. turnaround. She approached her guide to question why their timeline was more conservative. The guide explained that their group's oxygen supplies and client experience levels required the earlier schedule. Later, another team member mentioned that Holt had been asking whether the guides would actually enforce the turnaround if climbers were close to the summit. During the final equipment check at Camp 4, Holt asked whether 1 oxygen bottle would be sufficient if she used her breathing techniques to reduce consumption. The leader confirmed that 2 bottles were mandatory and not negotiable. Holt packed both, but told another climber she expected to use only 1. At 11:30 p.m., the team began the summit push. They reached the balcony at 4:20 a.m. and rested briefly. When supplemental oxygen use began, Holt activated one bottle at a reduced flow rate, intending to extend its duration. She left her second bottle cached at the balcony, telling her Sherpa she would retrieve it on the descent if needed. At 9:40 a.m., the team reached 28,700 feet on the final ridge approach. A line of approximately 30 climbers from multiple expeditions had formed on the fixed rope ahead, advancing roughly 50 feet every 10 minutes. The guide calculated their arrival time and determined the group could not reach the summit before 11 a.m. He instructed the group to descend. Holt unclipped from the fixed line and remained stationary. The guide repeated the instruction and gestured toward the descent route. When he touched her shoulder and pointed downward, she turned away and began moving upward along the edge of the fixed line, stepping around clipped-in climbers waiting their turn and disrupting the established order on the rope. The guide followed briefly, then stopped to radio for assistance and remained with the 3 other clients who agreed to descend. By 11:15 a.m., Holt had gained 80 feet and merged into traffic from 2 other expeditions. Her reduced flow rate had extended her bottle further than standard use, but by 10:45 a.m., it was empty. She continued upward using her breathing techniques, her pace slowing considerably. At 12:10 p.m., Holt reached the summit. She had climbed the final 130 feet without supplemental oxygen and stood at the top for approximately 3 minutes before beginning her descent. The traffic on the ridge had worsened in both directions. By 1:30 p.m., she was at 28,600 feet, moving slowly and no longer clipping and unclipping from the fixed rope correctly. At 2:05 p.m., she sat down on the narrow ridge. Her oxygen mask hung loosely over her face, connected to the empty bottle. She fumbled with her pack straps but could not manage the clips and did not respond to climbers passing, who asked if she needed help. At 2:20 p.m., she slumped sideways, her body held in place only by the Jumar still attached to the fixed line. 3 nearby climbers attempted to share oxygen using a spare regulator. Her breathing was already shallow and irregular. It stopped at 2:45 p.m. The incoming storm arrived that evening, and high winds the following day prevented any recovery above the south summit. Holt remained fixed to the rope at 28,600 feet, her second oxygen bottle still sitting at the balcony over 1,100 feet below. The investigation determined she died from acute hypoxia, compounded by exhaustion, concluding that caching her backup supply and refusing the turnaround had left her no margin for the traffic delays on the ridge. The report noted that controlled breathing techniques provide no meaningful protection against hypoxia in the death zone. She was not recovered until 6 weeks later. It was May 9th, 2015, at Camp 2 on Mount Everest, 21,300 feet up. Thin air, minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures, hidden crevasses, and icy patches made every step risky. One misstep could be deadly. Tessa Crane, 37, worked as a corporate consultant in Chicago. She thrived on pushing herself in high-pressure situations and expected that same drive to carry her up Everest. She had climbed several 14,000-foot peaks in Colorado, but nothing had prepared her for the sustained physiological stress of staying above 18,000 feet. 18 months of training had convinced her she could handle the climb. I can see she trusted her mental toughness more than her body's signals. That's a mistake a lot of people make up here, thinking willpower is enough. Altitude sickness often begins subtly, a headache, mild nausea, dizziness. But at 21,000 feet, these early signs can escalate rapidly. On the morning of May 9th, Tessa reported a mild headache and slight nausea, but insisted she could continue to Camp 3. Her guide recommended immediate descent to Camp 1. She refused. I get it. She probably felt like stopping would mean failure. But up here, ignoring your body is never worth it. Over the next several hours, her condition worsened. The headache intensified, nausea turned into repeated vomiting, and dizziness made each step uncertain. The cold and wind made rest stops. Exhausting, slowing the team even more. Every fixed rope she gripped required extra effort, and her balance became progressively unreliable. I can't help thinking how small decisions start stacking up. The choice to push forward despite the warning signs is one that snowballs quickly. By early afternoon, Tessa had developed high-altitude cerebral edema, a condition where fluid buildup in the brain causes swelling that impairs thinking, coordination, and consciousness. Her steps were unsteady, her grip on ropes weakened, and she needed constant support from the guides. On a steep section between Camp 2 and 3, she collapsed entirely, unable to move on her own. Breathing became irregular, supplemental oxygen barely helped, and the technical terrain made any descent slow and risky. It's kinda terrifying seeing someone so prepared and determined get beaten by altitude. You train and prep for months, but the mountain has its own rules. The guides worked carefully to move her down, securing ropes and taking each step slowly. Her intermittent consciousness made coordination impossible, and at times, she was completely unresponsive. Weather conditions and steep slopes prevented a rapid evacuation. I can't imagine how helpless it must feel to watch, knowing every second counts, but there's only so much you can do at that height. Hours passed as her condition deteriorated. The guides monitored her vitals and tried to prevent further decline, but the combination of brain swelling, hypoxia, and physical exhaustion progressed beyond the point where rescue alone could reverse it. Eventually, she lost consciousness permanently. It's sobering. There's no arguing with physiology at this altitude. The body just shuts down when it can't cope. The medical officer later confirmed the cause of death as high-altitude cerebral edema, with contributing factors including her refusal to descend when symptoms first appeared and the delayed recognition of the severity of her condition. It's hard not to reflect on how quickly a summit goal can turn deadly when pride or determination overrides basic survival instincts. Her death was documented in the expedition's medical logs and reported to Nepalese authorities, as is required for all climbing fatalities. It's a harsh reminder that the mountain isn't forgiving. No amount of preparation, money, or drive changes the fact that ignoring the body's signals can be fatal. Even after the incident, the evidence left on the route, abandoned gear, disturbed snow, and the path where she struggled, served as a stark visual cue for future climbers about how quickly things can go wrong. Looking at it, I can't help but feel the weight of those final hours. The effort, the willpower, all of it, and yet the body had the final say. That's something that really sticks with you about high altitude climbing.